Hello, my name is Eckhard Sonntag, and I'm glad to be able to share with you today about my research. I've been working on the Middle Eastern phenomenon of wasta, which literally means mediation, and it's a practice which can be found almost everywhere in Middle Eastern society. Now, I researched the characteristics of it, and then I used this as a reading environment for biblical passages which talk about Jesus as mediator between man and God. Now, my hypothesis is that this enriches the understanding of those texts first, and in particular, that it helps addressing one contentious question in Muslim-Christian dialogue, which is the person of Jesus as Son of God. Now, first let me give an overview of what wasta is. The term wasta derives from the Arabic root waw sin ta, meaning middle, and wasta denotes a middleman as well as the process of mediating any practical favor or brokering peace in a conflict. Now, wasta has been aptly called the hidden force in Middle Eastern society, and when moving to the Arab Middle East as a foreigner for work, for example, one is likely to encounter the word and the concept within a few weeks of arriving. And when talking about any process like applying for a job, for a school, university, or doing any sort of business or bureaucracy, Arabs will frequently add that you need a little wasta for this, or that they dispose of some wasta for that and this business to get done, and even that they're willing to offer it to you if you're in need of it. Now, in all these instances, it denotes a person who knows who's in a position to mediate an advantage or favor. And the word can be used for the mediator person as well as for the process or the concept in general. Now, some authors have suggested to subdivide wasta into two categories. The first is called intercessory wasta, and it denotes wasta as just described, so by the intercession of a middleman, maybe an uncle who works at the university, or a cousin who works in a government office. A client receives an advantage or a favor, so a place in the universities with treatment of some bureaucratic processes or similar. Now, a second aspect of wasta is the mediation in a conflict situation. And this is the second of the two subcategories and is referred to as mediational wasta. Now, the Arab Middle Eastern societies have been, and in many places still are, characterized by their tribal structures. They're also characterized by a high degree of collectivism, which means that the interests of the group are regarded more highly than the interests of the individual. And in such societies, any conflict between individuals is also often perceived as a conflict between their two respective in-groups, meaning their tribes, their families, their friendship circles. And when a conflict arises, the traditional standard mode of reconciliation is an intricate process of mediation. Now, this process involves elders from both families of both conflicting parties who serve as mediational wasta-personalities. And they get together and they negotiate first a truce, then reparations, and eventually they facilitate a formal expression of peacemaking, even a feast or a party. Now, having introduced the two categories of wasta, a remark needs to be made having to do with the terminology and in contemporary spoken Arabic. Now, Arabic native speakers regularly object that the second category, the mediational wasta, so brokering peace in a conflict, should not be called wasta at all. They refer to the mediator personalities involved in tribal conflict mediation as wasit, which is a different nominalization of the same root. Now, they vigorously object to associating those peacemaking elders with the word wasta at all, which they say is exclusively used to describe the intercessory mediation, like the mediation of favors and advantages, which I just described. Cunningham and Sarira, an American and an Arabic author who co-wrote one major monograph on the wasta phenomenon, first introduced the division into the mediational and the intercessory wasta, and many have actually followed them. However, in oral discussions on the topic, the objections still persist a lot. Now, I think the underlying difference appears to be that intercessory wasta is increasingly seen as a practice that is morally wrong, corrupt, unfair, and harmful in a world of limited resources and fierce competition. And the term wasta has increasingly strong taste of this, of corruption in the minds of many Arabs. Now, mediational wasta in turn is seen as very noble, as honorable, and always beneficial. So the desire to reflect that difference in the terminology is understandable. Now, the issue is not easily settled on a purely terminological level, partly because there's a lack of dictionaries which capture the evolution of meanings of words in contemporary spoken Arabic dialects. But also the semantic considerations are inseparably intertwined with sociological ones. So the precise meaning which the word carries might also depend on the personal backgrounds of the speakers. So whether it's a more or less tribal background, more rural, more urban, the speaker's education, their exposure to Western thinking, etc. Now, in this research, there's no need to judge wasta morally, ethically, or even economically. And just for the sake of sociological clarity, it's therefore appropriate to stick to the categorization of intercessory wasta and mediational wasta, even though some Arab speakers might prefer different usage. Wasta is ingrained into the tribal and family structures in many areas of the Middle East, and the flow of wasta requests and granted favors is first and foremost along the lines of kinship relations. In rural settings, usually the oldest male member of a family or someone of similar rank is in the position of being the wasta of the family, and this means that he's the spokesperson when problems with other families or tribes occur, as in mediational wasta, but it also often means that he is the main connection to the bureaucracy and business world of the capital. So he usually has a house close to the city. He will host family members coming to the capital to do business or having to go through some bureaucratic procedure, like renewing their passport, get a driver's license, etc. Now, ideally, this wasta will facilitate and speed up those processes through the context that he has. Now, in modern urban settings, the mechanics of wasta have partly changed. They are more diversified and more specialized, and people will usually aim at having a wasta network for all the things that they need. A major area for wasta remains the work life. All working members of family might often work in the same sector, so they can serve each other as wasta. But another one is education. But also apart from these major areas of life, wasta is practiced in the little things. If one man tells another that he wants to buy this or that, it's quite likely that the other one recommends a shop where he knows someone and refers him on. As the Arab societies are exposed to globalization and diversification and a certain degree of individualization, the wasta phenomenon also broadens. So wasta is still practiced first and foremost among family, but also among friends and colleagues and even strangers. And one important aspect in the give and take of wasta is the rule of reciprocation. Now, depending on how the wasta partners are related, the reciprocation of the wasta favor plays out differently. Concerning wasta between strangers, for example, there are now individuals who even sell wasta services in the field in which they work or have been working for quite good money. So a retired customs officer, for example, might open a clearance company and charge for the swift processing of customs transactions which he's able to offer due to his contacts. But wasta between friends is usually perceived as a matter of give and take, so subconsciously quite long lists might be kept. And it's never the aim in this to pay back a favor for a favor, so one gets even between two friends, but instead the constant giving and taking of wasta services is a force which holds together the whole network of relations, precisely because there are always obligations somewhere with someone in some way, and accounts are precisely not settled. Now lastly, when wasta is practiced among family, as it often is, reciprocation becomes quite different. Now, paying back favor for favor or even money for favor is not required. It would even be frowned on and viewed as shameful. And instead it is the wasta's obligation to help family members who are in need of something that he can offer. And serving them is a requirement, and it adds to his honor and the fame within the community. Failure to help would actually be shameful. And reciprocation of wasta favors within the family takes the shape of loyalty then, to the wasta and a grateful posture towards him, honoring and praising his help in front of the community. Now, what I want to do now is to use the phenomenon of wasta, as I just described it, which is, as we've said, a shaping force in Middle Eastern society, as an environment for looking at the person of Jesus as mediator between man and God. Now, in the Christian tradition, Jesus is in a position to be a mediator between man and God because he's said to be the Son of God and therefore divine and human. And the notion of Jesus as Son of God has been offensive to Muslims for two main reasons. And the first is that the Son, together with the Father and the Holy Spirit, makes up the Trinity of God in Christian theology, which obviously seemingly stands against the monotheistic confession of God being one. And the second one is that the particular idea of begetting a son and being begotten is explicitly ruled out as a characteristic of God. In the Quran, in Surah 112, verses 1 to 4, in the translation by Arbery, it reads, "Say, He is one God, God, the everlasting refuge, who is not begotten and has not been begotten, and equal to Him is not anyone." Now, this is deeply ingrained in the Muslim conscience, and I've been living and working in Amman, Jordan, for almost 5 years now. And once I was driving to work in a taxi with a particularly friendly driver, and we started chatting, and after he had found out that I was from Germany, he said, as it's not uncommon, "You are very welcome here in Jordan, and if there's anything you need help with, I'm ready." Then, however, without much of a transition, actually, he went on to give me some theological help he felt I needed, and he went on, "So you know, there is one thing you Christians need to know. God does not have a son." Now, there are different aspects to a sonship Christology, and accordingly, different problems emerge when it is discussed between Muslims and Christians. Now, we will look at some examples in a minute. But for the moment, it's important to note that it's not my hypothesis that the wasta reading environment which I will propose solves all these problems as such. But it's my contention that it will add a new angle of looking at the person of Jesus as God's Son that will foster understanding on the topic. Now, in the following, we will look at a few statements about Jesus as mediator from the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament. And before we do that, in the first century Greco-Roman world, and thus the social world of the New Testament, the practice of patronage and brokerage was widely practiced. And this practice is actually not dissimilar from present-day wasta in some respects. And things that are written in a society influenced by patronage resonate with our wasta context. The anthropologist Richard Antoon summarizes the essence of wasta society, saying, "A man's or a woman's case is best presented by others." Now, the same can be claimed as a basic principle of first-century Greco-Roman patronage societies. Now, the letter to the Hebrews is characterized by Christology, which emphasizes both the humanity and the divinity of Jesus, and it portrays Jesus as the Son of God in order to accomplish this, and thus it contains statements which sound particularly contentious and explosive in a Christian-Muslim dialogue context. So, for an example, we will look at the exordium of the letter, the chapter 1, the verses 1 to 4 and verses 5 and 8 of the second paragraph, which reads, "In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in many various ways. But in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things and through whom He made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. After He had provided purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So He became as much superior to the angels as the name He has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my Son, today I have become your Father'? Or again, 'I will be his Father and he will be my Son'?" In verse 8, "But about the Son He says, 'Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever, and righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom.'" Now, without going into detailed exegesis, let us just look at why this text should normally be the nightmare to anyone involved in Christian-Muslim dialogue. Now, first, while Muslim theologians affirm Jesus as a prophet, nothing more, nothing less, the writer to the Hebrews starts his document by insisting that Jesus is more. Verse 2, he is the Son, and as such he supersedes the prophets of the past. And he's coming in these last days, as it says, so the superiority of this mediator of God's revelation is said to be a final supremacy, really. It's categorically different from the prophets. Now, second, if you look at verse 3, it's emphasized that the identification of God and Jesus by calling Jesus the reflection of God's glory and the imprint of God's being. Now, these expressions are reminiscent of Alexandrian wisdom theology and the closeness they express between God and Jesus in almost mythical terms seems to blur the boundaries between the divine and the human realm. And third, again in verse 3, it also states that Jesus has made purification of sins and now sits at the place of honor at God's right hand. And both of these statements really seem to undercut the minimum distance required between the side of God, who gives forgiveness of sin and is seated in a position of unparalleled highness and worthiness, and the side of sinful humanity in the created realm below, in need of God's grace and forgiveness. Fourth, the excellency and highness claimed for Jesus is then, in verse 4 and 5, anchored in that name or designation, Son, and the author chooses Psalm 2 verse 7 as the first of two proof texts. And this psalm, which is originally a coronation psalm, has God saying to the new king, "You are my son," and then goes on with one of the most contentious notions of all in Muslim Christian discourse, which is, "Today I have become your father," or literally, "Today I have begotten you." And the Greek word for beget, the genau, renders the Hebrew yalat, which is the same root as the Arabic yalat in Surah 112 verse 3, this fierce objection to the thought that God begets us, begotten, that we discussed earlier. Now, so even if one were to argue that in the original context of the psalm this was only meant metaphorically, in other cultures of the time it was held that the king as son of God was actually a divine being, not human, and the contentious notion of begetting is boldly applied to Jesus by the writer to the Hebrews here. And lastly, actually even worse, Jesus, the Son's highness and identity with God is such that the author even applies Psalm 45 verse 6 and 7 to him. To the Son he says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever." So this document, the letter to the Hebrews, begins on seemingly very unhelpful notions of sonship, which will stir the opposition of Muslim theology. But as said earlier, I don't hold that these difficulties will simply go away when the concept of wasta is applied as a reading and dialogue environment. But even those very contentious statements might appear in a different light in the context of the whole document, in the context of wasta. Now, it's the aim of the author of the letter to the Hebrews to encourage his readers by portraying Jesus as their supreme mediator of the new covenant. See chapter 9 verse 15 and chapter 12 verse 24. Now, the covenant implies two things. First, reconciliation, and thus, as with mediation wasta, overcoming conflict and re-establishing peaceful relations. And secondly, it implies access to God as the giver of great favors and gifts, analogous to intercessory wasta. Now, over the course of the 13 chapters of the document, the author of Hebrews develops this argument that Jesus is the ultimate mediator of a new covenant between man and God. And he does this by drawing on the sun motif, as mentioned, but he also brings in other imagery and metaphors. The prime one being that of a mediating high priest. And I want us to look at a passage in the second chapter of the document where the author is working towards first stating that Jesus is this mediating high priest. And note how familial imagery is used to express the identification of the mediator with both parties in the mediation process, now the human and the divine. Now this is Hebrews 2 verse 11. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. From verse 17, for this reason he had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. So the mediator and the clients of the mediation have to be of the same family, literally from one, most likely meaning from one father in verse 11. And Jesus the mediator had to be made like the brothers and sisters in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Or in other words, in order that he might become a successful mediator. Now the familial imagery is taken a step further in the next chapter, and chapter 3 verses 2 to 3 and 6 read as follows. Now he, Jesus, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. In verse 6, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house, if we hold on to our confidence and the hope of which we glory. Now, reading these verses in our chosen reading environment and applying the related context of first century patronage, we can appreciate the God-Son Christology of the author in the following way. First of all, the argument in Hebrews now appears very familiar to the world of the Middle Eastern mediation. A mediator has to participate in the two realms between which he's mediating. So just like a wasta person who participates in my world by being a friend or family member, and who participates in the world in which I need a favor or an advantage, say the customs department, by being a senior official there. So without yet having the intricate Christology of the creeds of the early church, the writer is making here a necessary and by standards of Middle Eastern mediation very conclusive point, which is that the mediator between man and God has to participate in the reality of the Godhead. Thus he is the Son, positioned intimately close to God in his highness, but yet at the same time he also has to be made like the brothers and sisters, meaning that he participates in the reality of humanity on behalf of whom he is to mediate. Now, the notion of Jesus being the son over God's house in chapter 3 verse 6 illustrates the point even further. Now this becomes clear when the verse is viewed in the context of ancient patronage, and David de Silva is worth quoting at length here. He says, "The close relatives of the emperor, especially his sons, were sought after as mediators of the emperor's favor. Their close familial relationship to the patron of the empire gave great hope of success. Thus, when the author of Hebrews presents Jesus as son in 1 verse 2 and constructs his comparison of Jesus with the angels in 1 verse 4 to 14, his aim appears to be to emphasize the greater proximity of Jesus to God as mediator of divine favor. Throughout Hebrews, one finds members of God's extended household at various degrees of remove, contrasted with Jesus. Moses is a faithful and hence trusted servant in God's house, chapter 3 verse 2. As a valued servant of the household, Moses would provide a certain level of access to the patron of the house, namely God. The author stresses, however, that the believers have gained the Son as their patron and broker of God's favor. Their access to favor is assured by the mediation of the one who stands in such close proximity to God that he bears the reflected radiance of God's glory, chapter 1 verse 3. So one aspect why mediation of God's favor through the Son makes so much sense is that, just as in patronage at the time of Jesus, the Son was the ultimate broker of the Father's favor. Now, the familial imagery that is so contentious in Muslim-Christian dialogue is actually intrinsic to the logic of Middle Eastern mediation. So the familial imagery of Hebrews expresses the mediational relationship that is needed in the context of wasta or patronal societies. The fact that Jesus calls humanity brothers and sisters, as per chapter 2 verse 11, serves as an assurance that the mediator participates in the human side, and the high sonship Christology of chapter 1 is the assurance that also the link to the divine patron is reliably provided. Now, the familial imagery might also bring out another reassurance, particularly as it shines in the light of present-day wasta. As mentioned above, the reciprocation in wasta is obligatory among friends, and between family it's different. As we said, there's no need for reciprocation. It is expected and taken for granted that between family members the mediation is given freely, and shame is put on the one who doesn't help as mediator when he could have, and when he's being asked by family. So in that sense, there is here a logical and even a necessary point that Jesus is the mediator and being made like the brothers and sisters, because otherwise the rules of wasta mediation would require that humans pay God back in kind for the favor granted if he weren't family. Now this is incongruent with Christian as well as Muslim belief, and instead, because the mediation is happening between family, the reciprocation takes different shape, which is the shape of loyalty and praise for God the patron, both values very much at the heart of Muslim and Christian piety. The letter to the Hebrews expresses the divine sonship of Jesus Christ, which is at the heart of Christian belief, in a particularly pointed manner. It's therefore particularly contentious also in Muslim-Christian dialogue, but as we've seen, rereading parts of it in this light of the sociology of wasta and ancient patronage can add an interpretative layer which eases the tension and helps mutual understanding. Christian-Muslim theological dialogue, especially on the contentious topic of the person of Jesus, will be influenced by the environment in which it takes place and the presuppositions that go with this. So one might default to discussing the matter starting from the presuppositions of the creeds of the early church, and then discuss if Jesus is son, divine, human, according to his nature or to his person, and all these things. As we've seen, the sociology of Middle Eastern mediation can be an alternative framework for that same dialogue, that same discussion. And dialogue in one environment might not answer questions which have come out of dialogue in the other. So dialogue partners should not have wrong expectations here. But shifting to a different reading environment might shine a new light on common interpretations. And imagining Jesus as the wasta between man and God when reading the letter to the Hebrews might put Christians as well as Muslims in a better place for dialogue with each other.